'cause you can't, you won't, and you don't stop. Or when you can't, you won't, and you don't stop. Might be coming back for sure,
I think that consideration needs to move from the promisee, but not necessarily to the promisor. We're going to come up to the second rule, which is consideration needs to be sufficient, but need not be adequate. Man, what a confusing saying, right? So what that means is that consideration must be something. It can't be nothing. Okay. Let's have a look at the case of Thomas and Thomas to help us get an understanding of what the law is trying to say here. So Thomas and Thomas is a classic case around this particular principle. What happens in the case? Well, Mr. Thomas actually dies, unfortunately, and as part of his will, he says he wants Mrs. Thomas to be able to use the house for the rest of her life, that she should have the house while she's still alive. But he actually didn't leave her the house in the will. So the executors of the will, they say to Mrs. T, look, you can live in the house for the rest of your life, provided you pay rent of, it was £1, but let's go $1 a year. Now, very clearly, $1 a year is not what the rent should have been. Okay, it's way, way, way below market value. And in fact, later, when this contract gets challenged, right, they're saying, look, this isn't good consideration. It's very clearly below what the market would ask for. However, what the court said was it was something. Okay, so really the principle here is that the courts don't want to second guess the parties. Look, if you're willing to enter a contract for $1, that's up to you, right? Who are we to say it's worth $1 or $5 or $1,000? If we start doing that, we start really interfering with commerce, right? Because where do you draw the line? So it should be up to you as to what you want to contract. And as a little side note, this is the kind of case where we get the saying a peppercorn rent, right, which you may or may not have heard of. But back in these days, you might actually have a contract that you could stay in the house for a year for a peppercorn, right, which is like worth virtually nothing, but it's something. As long as there's something, we have good consideration. If we have nothing, then we don't have good consideration. So what's nothing? Well, clearly a promise, just a bare promise is nothing. But what else is nothing? So the law wants us to be free to make our own choices, and they won't question what is reasonable or fair if it looks like a true bargain. For instance, you might pay a lot of money for a collectible, right? I mean, how much is a piece of paper with a picture on it worth? I don't know, whatever people will pay. But a baseball card that's rare, people will literally pay millions of dollars for a piece of paper with a picture. NFTs are the latest, idea behind that. It's really nothing. It's just digital, but it's worth. But if people want to pay for it, the law won't get in the way, and it is something. It's the right to say you own it and to reproduce it, etc. Okay, so even the most trivial payment or promise qualifies as sufficient consideration. Consideration needs to be sufficient, but need not be adequate. It need not be market value or, valuable at all. It just needs to be something. But what is not something? Okay, 3 things that we're going to look at. A vague promise is insufficient. Past consideration is insufficient. And a promise to do something you're already legally obliged to do, insufficient. So let's look at some cases to help us with that. Okay, so in Roscola and Thomas, we have a person purchasing a horse from another person. So they give dollars and the horse comes from A to B. Now, after they've exchanged, right, and the horse has been delivered, B then says, oh, by the way, the horse is free from vice. That just means that the horse was tamed and not at all vicious. What of course happens? the horse is vicious, and I think it actually bites person A. If you've ever been bitten by, if you ever know anything about a horse bite, that's pretty bad. Like, it sounds funny, but it's pretty bloody bad, because a horse can't actually open its mouth, so it latches on and it has to rip off. Anyway, let's not get into horse bites. So the horse bites A. A tries to sue B, right, for this promise, tries to get out of the contract, right? This is a term of the contract was that it's free from vice. Okay. Court held that that promise, right, occurred after the contract. So we need another contract here. And that A argued, right, that they had paid, but they had paid in the past. Can you see that? Because this promise here from B comes after the contract's finished. So they've already paid. Because they've already paid, they're paying nothing for this promise. If that promise had been as part of the contract during the negotiations, yes, but it's not, it's after. So that means A's payment is past consideration. And past consideration is insufficient because you've already paid it. So you're really giving nothing. So past consideration is not good consideration. Collins and Godfrey. So Godfrey really wanted Collins to attend a court and give evidence in a court case that Godfrey had running. So Godfrey agreed to pay in turn for Collins promising to turn up, right? Because he's really keen. So you can see that looks like consideration there. However, Collins had been subpoenaed, which means legally C had to attend. Okay, so Collins already had to go. So because he's legally has to go anyway, the promise to turn up is worth nothing. He had a pre-existing legal obligation. So if you're already obliged to do something by contract or by a court case like subpoenaing, then whatever you promise around that is not good consideration unless it extends beyond what you're legally required to do. If it extends beyond what you're legally required to do, then it's good consideration. And I'll leave you to look up Glasgow and Glamorgan County Council to see that particular point. So what is insufficient consideration? A vague promise is uncertain and therefore has no legal value. Promising to be nice, to stop complaining, or to be a good student, right? You need to be more specific. A vague promise, we can't determine what it means. Past consideration is not good consideration. Okay, if the price paid for promise was paid before the promise was made, you've given nothing for the promise. A pre-existing legal obligation. If the price paid by the promisee is the fulfillment of a prior legal obligation, it's not sufficient consideration. Really importantly, if you already owe money, right, and you pay some of it back on the same terms, etc., in the same time period, that's not good consideration for the person who you owe the money to. If you have a public duty, if you have a contractual duty, they're not good consideration. So to summarize, consideration needs to be sufficient but need not be adequate. So it doesn't need to be market value, but it needs to be something. Must move from the promisee, not necessarily to the promisor. The final thing to leave you with is that there are some contracts that do need to be in writing, that this simple apparent contract rules won't apply. They're contracts like deeds. Okay, so I'll leave you to read that slide. We're not going to deal with them in depth. But just because you don't have consideration doesn't mean you don't have a contract, because there are some things that you can do, like a deed with a formal process that will ensure a promise is enforceable. But in general, most of what we deal with are simple apparent contracts, and we need agreement, intent, consideration. Okay, so if we've got those three, what do we do next? Well, now we need to check that the contract is valid. And there's a number of things about enforceability that we want to cover. For instance, did we truly agree? Was there true consent? So that's what we're going to get to in our next video.